Dale Hall's new desperation. It was the stale taste of instant coffee at 3 a.m., the accusatory glare of a blank laptop screen, and the gnawing fear that his talent, if he'd ever truly possessed any, had packed its bags and hitched a ride out of his life on the last Greyhound. He was a freelance writer, which was a polite way of saying he was intermittently employed and perpetually broke. His tiny third-floor apartment in a forgotten part of Derry always seemed to smell faintly of old takeout and the ghosts of unpaid bills. It was during one of his increasingly frequent inspiration walks, which were really just an excuse to escape the suffocating presence of his own failure, that he stumbled upon Relic's Rags. The thrift store was a shadowed cavern crammed with the detritus of countless lives, smelling of mothballs, decaying paper, and a faint, underlying metallic tang that Dale couldn't quite place. Presiding over this kingdom of cast-offs was Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face seemed composed entirely of wrinkles, and whose eyes, small and sharp like a crow's, appeared to see not just Dale, but the ragged edges of his ambition and the hollowness of his bank account. It was in the furthest, gloomiest corner, beneath a pile of threadbare doilies and a one-eyed teddy bear, that Dale found the lamp. It was an abomination of brass, a rococo nightmare. The base was a tarnished, vaguely floral sculpture, supporting a stem that twisted like an arthritic limb, culminating in a mustard yellow lampshade that looked as if it had witnessed several decades of heavy smoking. The pull chain was greasy, its small brass bauble worn smooth. Yet, when Dale tentatively plugged it into a nearby socket, the single bulb within cast a surprisingly bright, clean, almost surgically precise cone of white light. $5, Mrs. Gable rasped from behind the counter, her voice like dry leaves skittering across concrete. She didn't smile, but the corners of her eyes crinkled in a way that wasn't entirely pleasant. Some things, they just like to burn bright. Back in his apartment, the lamp looked even more incongruous and ugly amidst his own meager furnishings. But when he switched it on, that focused beam cut through the room's oppressive dimness like a laser. He sat at his battered desk, and for the first time in weeks, the words began to come. No, not just come, they surged. The usual fog of fatigue, the insidious mental static that always crippled him around 2 a.m., simply wasn't there. He wrote with a manic, focused energy, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The piece he was working on, a commissioned article about local folklore he'd been dreading, transformed under his touch. It became sharp, insightful, laced with a dark, ironic humor he didn't know he possessed. When he finally looked up, leery but exhilarated, dawn was painting the dirty window gray. He'd written for 8 straight hours. The lamp became his nocturnal companion, his all-nighter. His productivity skyrocketed. He finished backlogged assignments, started a new short story, a grim, unsettling piece about a man who finds a strange object at a thrift store, and even began outlining a novel. He never felt tired, not truly, as long as that unwavering white light pinned him to his desk. But the world outside that cone of illumination began to seem dimmer, less real. The shadows in the corners of his apartment deepened, grew more absolute. His writing, while undeniably powerful, took on a progressively darker, more cynical tone. His characters were cruel, their motivations base, their fates invariably grim. He was getting praise, even a few new, better-paying assignments. But sometimes, reading over what he'd written in the lamp's harsh glare, a chill would trace its way down his spine. These weren't his thoughts, not entirely. Then the memory gaps started. He'd find himself staring at a completed page, paragraphs of intricate, disturbing prose, with no conscious recollection of having written them. He'd forget appointments, lose track of days. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a gaunt stranger with sunken, feverishly bright eyes and skin like old parchment. Yet, the moment he sat under the lamp, the artificial energy would flood back, a cold, exhilarating rush. The metallic taste in his mouth, which he'd initially attributed to too much coffee, was now a constant companion. One pre-dawn morning, as the lamp hummed with a new, almost eager intensity, He reached to turn it off. His fingers brushed the greasy pull chain, and a jolt, not of static electricity but of pure, invasive coldness, shot up his arm, making his teeth ache. The light flickered violently for a horrifying, elongated second. The shadows beyond the focus beam seemed to writhe, to stretch and coalesce into vaguely human shapes, their forms indistinct but their presence undeniably malevolent, watching. He snatched his hand back, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The lamp's hum settled, and the shadows receded, but not entirely. Driven by a gnawing dread he could no longer ignore, Dale started examining the lamp more closely. Tucked deep into a crevice in his tarnished base, almost invisible, was a small, folded piece of yellowed newsprint. Carefully, he extracted it. It was a tiny, brittle fragment of an obituary dated nearly 50 years prior. It spoke of a reclusive local author, Alistair Finch, known for his prolific and increasingly disturbing late-career works, who had been found dead at his writing desk. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest due to extreme exhaustion, but a parenthetical note mentioned peculiar patterns of neural activity inconsistent with natural causes. Dale felt the room tilt. He'd recently read an obscure collection of Finch's later stories, marveling at their bleak power and unsettling style, a style that felt horrifyingly similar to what was now pouring out of him. He knew then, with a certainty that settled like a shroud, that the lamp wasn't merely banishing sleep or sparking creativity. It was a siphon, a parasite. It was drinking his memories, his vitality, perhaps even his soul, and in return, it was channeling something else, something old and dark and insatiable that had once belonged to Alistair Finch. He looked at the manuscript pages piling up on his desk, brilliant, chilling, and utterly alien. He thought of Mrs. Gable's knowing, crinkled eyes. Some things just like to burn bright. The all-nighter lamp hummed on his desk, its focused white eye unwavering, patiently waiting for him to return to its embrace, to feed it more of himself, one brilliant, terrifying word at a time. And Dale, with a weariness that went far beyond the physical, felt his hand reach almost involuntarily for his pen. The story, after all, wasn't finished. It was never finished. Sarah didn't have many places to go, not really. Home was a tight, silent apartment where her mom's grief had settled like a permanent layer of dust after Dad left. School was a blur of faces that never quite focused on hers. So she volunteered at the last stop thrift, Treasure, a sprawling, cavernous store on the edge of Derry that smelled of mothballs, forgotten attics, and the faint, collective sigh of 1,000 discarded lives. It was run by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose age was indeterminate, her eyes holding a curious, bird-like sharpness that missed nothing. In the store's deepest, most shadowed corner, among teetering stacks of old magazines and boxes of chipped porcelain, stood Gladys. Gladys was a vintage mannequin, probably from the 50s, made of that heavy, cool plaster that always felt faintly clammy. Her blonde painted hair was chipped, one penciled eyebrow arched higher than the other in a look of perpetual, mild surprise, or perhaps disdain. Her most prominent feature was her smile, a slash of unnervingly bright, cupids, bow red, fixed and serene. Most days, Mrs. Gable would drape Gladys in whatever new arrivals were too threadbare or too eccentric for the main racks. A faded dance dress, a man's oversized tweed coat, a feathered hat shedding its ancient plumage. Sarah, tasked with sorting and pricing in that forgotten section, was the first to feel that Gladys wasn't entirely static. It wasn't anything you could pinpoint easily, nothing that would make sense if you said it out loud. One afternoon, she'd be sure Gladys's head was tilted slightly to the left, eyes aimed towards a box of yellowed lace. The next morning, the head would be almost imperceptibly straighter, the gaze shifted towards the dusty window. The plastic hands, unnervingly detailed down to their painted cuticles, would seem to rest a fraction differently on the fabric she wore. Just the old floorboard settling, dear, Mrs. Gable would say when Sarah, hesitant and unsure, mentioned it. This old building breathes, you know? Or maybe Gladys just likes a change of scenery. Mrs. Gable's own smile then would be thin and knowing, making Sarah feel foolish. But the smile, Gladys's smile, was the thing that truly burrowed under Sarah's skin. It was, of course, painted on, immutable. Yet, Sarah began to sense, then to see. She was almost sure of it. Subtle shifts in its quality. When a box of children's brightly colored, well-loved clothes arrived, Gladys's smile, for a fleeting moment, seemed softer, almost wistful. When a severe, dark suit worn by a stern-looking man in a faded photograph was draped over her, the smile took on a colder, more authoritative edge. And sometimes, particularly when Sarah was handling items heavy, with a palpable sense of past sorrow, a wedding dress with a faint tear near the hem, a baby's christening gown yellowed with age, Gladys's smile seemed to widen. Not by much, just a millimeter, a fractional upturn at the corners, but it transformed the expression from placid to something else, knowing, anticipatory, almost hungry. The painted red lips would seem fuller, the curve more pronounced, more predatory. The day the black velvet dress arrived, things escalated. It came in a cedar chest, part of an estate sale from a reclusive woman who had died alone. The dress was exquisite, old-fashioned, smelling faintly of expensive, forgotten perfume and something else, a dry, earthy scent that reminded Sarah of crypts. Mrs. Gable, with an uncharacteristic gleam in her sharp eyes, insisted it go on Gladys immediately. Show her off, Sarah. Some things deserve an audience, even if it's just us. As Sarah carefully maneuvered the heavy velvet onto the mannequin's cool, unyielding form, she felt a distinct chill emanate from Gladys, colder than the usual basement draft. When she stepped back to admire the effect, her breath caught. Gladys, draped in the sumptuous black, looked regal, almost vampiric. And her smile, it was wider than Sarah had ever seen it, stretched into a grotesque, triumphant rictus that pulled the painted skin taut over the mannequin's cheekbones. The usually flat, painted eyes seemed to hold a spark of cold, possessive amusement, and they were fixed directly on Sarah. A faint sound, like the rustle of heavy silk or dry leaves skittering across a floor, seemed to emanate from Gladys's hollow chest. It wasn't quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but something in between, something ancient and utterly devoid of warmth. Sarah backed away slowly, her heart hammering. The air around Gladys felt thick, charged. She started having dreams. Gladys, always in the black velvet dress, standing in the corner of her bedroom, that terrible, widened smile fixed on her. Sometimes in the dream, the mannequin would raise a hand, its long, pale fingers beckoning. Sarah would wake up, drenched in sweat, the phantom scent of old perfume and damp earth clinging to her. She tried to avoid Gladys's corner, but it was as if the mannequin exerted a subtle pull, and Mrs. Gable always seemed to have a task for her nearby. "Dust Gladys off, dear. She's looking a bit neglected," she'd say, that knowing little smile playing on her own lips. One evening, as Sarah was locking up, she took one last reluctant look towards Gladys's corner. The mannequin stood draped in a simple, donated housecoat now, the black velvet dress having been sold to a woman with equally unsettling eyes earlier that day. Gladys's smile was back to its usual, placid red slash, but as Sarah turned to leave, she could have sworn she saw, just for a fraction of a second, the fabric of the housecoat ripple, as if something beneath it had taken a shallow breath. And the smile, for that same fleeting instant, seemed to hint at the terrifying, hungry grin she knew it was capable of. The last stop thrift treasure, Sarah was beginning to understand with a cold, creeping certainty, wasn't just a repository for old clothes. It was a place where forgotten things waited, and sometimes they found new ways to wear their histories. The silence in Elsie Carmichael's small house since Arthur passed was more than just an absence of his rumbling laugh or the clink of his teacup. It was a physical presence, a heavy, gray shroud that muffled the world. Arthur, her husband of 53 years, had been a man of comfortable noises. Now, the stillness pressed in, amplifying the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind. Her button collection, once a shared, gentle hobby, became Elsie's solitary anchor. Each small disc of pearl, bakelite, or brass was a tiny, tangible piece of history, a miniature story she could hold. She found the box at the St. Michael's annual rummage sale, held in the church's damp, echoing basement. It was a dreary Saturday, rain lashing against the grimy high windows. The box itself was unassuming, tucked beneath a pile of moth-eaten crocheted afghans and yellowed hymnals. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, almost black with age, with no carvings or adornments, only a small, tarnished brass clasp. It felt strangely cold to the touch. The harried woman at the table, a Mrs. Henderson whose smile didn't quite reach her tired eyes, barely glanced at it. "Oh, that old thing. $2, dear, just clearing out the donations." There was something in Mrs. Henderson's haste to be rid of it that pricked at the edge of Elsie's awareness, but the allure of unknown buttons was too strong. Back in the suffocating silence of her living room, Elsie placed the box on the worn lace doily, covering Arthur's old armchair. The brass clasp opened with a faint, dry click. Inside, nestled on faded velvet that might once have been crimson, lay hundreds of buttons. A breathtaking, chaotic assortment. Lustrous mother-of-pearl buttons shimmering with captured rainbows. Severe black jet buttons like polished sorrow. Whimsical bakelite animals. Heavy, intricately stamped military brass. Delicate, hand-painted porcelain florals. Even crude, carved bone toggles that spoke of an even older, more rustic past. Her fingers, gnarled with age but still nimble, hovered over them. She selected a small, unassuming ivory button, smooth and cool. The moment her thumb brushed its surface, a sensation, vivid and overwhelming, flooded her mind. It wasn't a thought or a memory, but a full sensory immersion. Sunlight dappling through leaves, the joyous, slightly off-key sound of a child singing, the scent of freshly baked bread, a wave of pure, uncomplicated happiness, so potent it made Elsie's own heart ache with a bittersweet pang. Startled, she dropped the button as if it had burned her. It clattered back into the box, the vision vanishing as quickly as it came. Her heart thrummed. It had felt so real. After a moment's hesitation, a mixture of fear and an irresistible curiosity compelled her to try another. This time, a flat, chipped ceramic button, painted with a faded bluebird. The rough feel of a wool blanket, the metallic tang of fear in her mouth, hushed, urgent whispers in a language she didn't understand, the rhythmic, terrifying creak of a ship's timbers in a storm, a profound sense of dread and seasickness. Elsie snatched her hand away, gasping. It was like this with every button. Each one was a tiny, condensed life, a fleeting but overwhelmingly potent echo of an emotion, a moment. A delicate glass button brought the thrill of a secret, illicit kiss in a moonlit garden. A heavy, utilitarian work shirt button delivered the bone-weary exhaustion and quiet satisfaction of a long day's honest labor. A tiny silver christening button pulsed with the fierce, protective love of a new mother. For the first time since Arthur's passing, Elsie felt something other than the dull ache of grief. She felt connected. The box became her obsession. She neglected her meals, her small garden, the concerned phone calls from her sister. Days blurred into a kaleidoscope of borrowed experiences. She would sit for hours, her fingers sifting through the buttons, deliberately choosing, then later, almost involuntarily drawn to specific ones. The gentle, happy echoes were a balm, but increasingly, she found herself drawn to the darker currents, the stronger, more turbulent emotions. A tarnished, brass uniform button, the deafening roar of cannon fire, the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood, the searing pain of a bayonet wound, a final, gasping breath of terror. A smooth, black stone button, the suffocating despair of a prison cell, the endless drip of water, the slow erosion of hope into madness. These darker echoes began to bleed into her reality. She'd catch fleeting glimpses of figures in period dress at the edge of her vision. The scent of gunpowder or unfamiliar, cloying perfumes would drift through her living room. Sometimes she'd feel a phantom pain in her side or a crushing weight on her chest, mirroring the final moments of some long-dead stranger. The silence of her house was no longer empty. It was filled with the whispers, the sighs, the choked sobs of 1,000 forgotten lives. Paranoia began to set in. Was Arthur's gentle presence being crowded out by these more violent, more demanding ghosts? The box itself seemed to develop a personality, a subtle sentience. It felt warmer some days, and she could almost swear she heard a faint, collective sigh or hum emanating from it when she entered the room. It seemed to want its stories to be experienced, to be felt, to be acknowledged. It was feeding on her, she vaguely realized. Not her life force, perhaps, but her attention, her emotional resonance. And she was a willing participant, addicted to the intensity, the sheer, overwhelming flood of feeling after so long in the gray fog of her loss. Only one button remained untouched, nestled at the very bottom of the box, partially obscured by the others. It was larger than most, made of a dull, heavy, oddly cold brass, with a strange, almost indiscernible symbol etched into its surface. Elsie had avoided it, a primal instinct warning her away. It felt different from the others, not just holding a memory, but radiating a profound ancient malevolence. The other buttons, even the most tragic, felt like echoes of human experience. This one felt alien, inhuman. The stories from the other buttons began to fade, their emotional charge lessening as if their essence had been spent. Or perhaps, as if the big brass button was now drawing all the power to itself. It pulsed in her awareness, a cold, insistent throb in the quiet of the house, calling to her. She knew with a certainty that settled like grave dust in her soul that this was the final story, the one the box had been leading her to all along. Her hand trembled as she reached into the box, fingers brushing past the spent, familiar forms. They felt like dead things now. Only the brass button held that cold, vibrant thrum. She hesitated, a lifetime of quiet prudence warring with the insatiable, addictive hunger the box had cultivated within her. Then, with a sigh that was part me and Arthur's, part her own, and part something else entirely, she picked it up. The moment her skin made contact, the world didn't just flash, it shattered. There was no single scene, no one emotion. It was a cacophony, a maelstrom of pure, unadulterated suffering from 1,000 sources, 1,000 times, all compressed into one unbearable instant. It was the collective agony of every soul whose small trinket had ended up in this accursed box, amplified, concentrated, and funneled directly into her. But beneath it, driving it, was something else, a cold, ancient, endlessly patient consciousness, a being that wove itself from despair, that harvested sorrow. She saw it, a shadowy form at the heart of a storm of human misery, its tendrils reaching out, gathering the lost, the broken, the grieving, drawing them in through these small discarded tokens. Elsie screamed, a raw, soundless shriek that tore through her mind, but never left her lips. Her body convulsed, the button searing cold against her palm. She saw herself, a tiny figure, being pulled into that swirling vortex of shared despair, her own grief a fresh, potent offering. When her sister finally broke down the door a week later, alerted by unanswered calls, she found Elsie sitting in Arthur's armchair, the wooden box open on her lap. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, fixed on some distant, horrifying vista. A single, heavy brass button was clutched tightly in her right hand. Her face was a mask of serene, utter emptiness. The silence in the house was back, deeper and more absolute than ever before. The button box was full again, patiently waiting.